Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you to We Need to Name This, where we unpack the hidden curriculum of academe with scholars of color. So my name is Ebony Perez Harvey and my co-host,
Laura Ann Jacobs.
So we're going to share a few episodes with you about things that we had questions about and conversations that we've had during our time in academia. So today's episode is entitled Tenure or Clinical Track? How do I determine a fit? So we would like to introduce two awesome and inspiring women of color, Dr. Debi Khasnabis and Dr. Rosie Perez, that will share with us their experiences and how they determined what track was a good fit for them. But first, we would like to share a bit about them. So I'm going to start with Dr. Debi Khasnabis. Debi Khasnabis teaches courses in multicultural and multilingual education in the Elementary Teacher Education Program and is chair of the Elementary Teacher Education Program at the University of Michigan School of Education. She conducts research on pedagogies of teacher education that support the development of culturally responsive teaching. Dr. Khasnabis has designed professional development opportunities for practicing teachers across Southeast Michigan on the topics of homelessness in schools, anti-bias education, trauma-informed practice, culturally responsive teaching, family outreach, and multilingual learners. Prior to her work at the University of Michigan, Dr. Khasnabis was an elementary bilingual teacher, Spanish and English, in Southwest Detroit. She earned her BA in Spanish and MA in elementary education at the University of Michigan. Her educational specialist at Wayne State University in bilingual education, curriculum, and instruction, and her PhD in literacy, language, and culture in educational studies at the University of Michigan. Dr. Khasnabis is orally proficient in Bengali, her home language.
Thank you so much, Ebony.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
And I would like to introduce Dr. Rosie Perez. Dr. Perez is an associate professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education at the University of Michigan. She earned her BS in biological sciences with an additional major in psychology at the Carnegie Mellon University and her MED in higher education and student affairs at the University of Vermont. Dr. Perez worked in residence life at the University of San Francisco and American University before earning her PhD in higher education from the University of Michigan. Dr. Perez's research uses student development and organizational theories to explore individual and organizational learning and development in collegiate contexts. Across projects, she explores the tension between structure and agency and how power, privilege, and oppression affect individuals and groups within higher education. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, Spencer Foundation, Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation, and ACPA College Student Educators International, and has published in venues such as Journal of College Student Development, Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, Journal of Higher Education, and the Review of Higher Education. Dr. Perez is also a mother, scholar, and wife who loves to exercise, drink coffee, and cheer on her favorite sports teams.
It's so great to have you all today. We're really super excited. And we just have some questions for you just to talk about your experiences. And we're just really, really excited to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the title of today's episode is Tenure or Clinical Track? How do I determine the fit? And so we thought we would open up by just asking what the difference is between tenure track or clinical track. What do those words mean, and what should we know about them as we start this conversation?
Well, when I think about the clinical track, you know, the piece that stands out is the clinical, the practice, that direct bridge to, in my case, to schools and to the work of teachers, and thinking really carefully about, especially about teaching. So any work that is focused on teaching, whether in teacher education or teaching in K-12 schools, that application piece is what stands out. So for me personally, I was coming from a place of, just loving being a teacher. I was so invested in my career as a teacher that honing in that space of studying it more and thinking about the work of teachers as it's nested within school districts, and thinking about the experience of children in those classrooms was especially important to me. So that's what made clinical really seem right for me.
And so I'm a tenure track professor, and actually now tenured, which is exciting, finally. So tenure track positions you'll often hear the term 40-40-20. And so the allocation of time is most often 40% research, 40% teaching, and 20% service, whether that be institutional service, service to the profession. I will say at some institutions, you have some negotiation around that. So I know some folks who have done like 60% research and taught less if that was where they thought their strengths best lie, or they had a lot of external funding. So they needed more time to do that and probably weren't as interested sometimes, to be honest, around teaching. My interest in a tenure track position is that I actually found out I liked research a lot more than I thought coming in. I was coming in to doctoral study as a practicing student affairs educator. I worked with college students who lived on campus in housing and residence life. I lived in with them, and really saw myself joining the faculty to be able to train educators who wanted to work at universities. And I knew that research was part of that. So initially my thinking was much more focused on teaching. And through the doctoral journey, I discovered that I had as strong of an interest in teaching, and the relationship between teaching and my research. They didn't live in separate spaces for me. So I think that guided me eventually to looking towards a tenure track position. And then, to be honest, as we're thinking about the purpose of this, some of it was the structural constraints of just knowing, like, I don't know if I can live in a position that might be term. As somebody who was not moving by myself, like I just was like, if we're going to relocate, I want to know that this is likely to be longer than either a visiting or a term appointment. Even though tenure is not guaranteed.
And I might add, just based on the framing that Rosie gave, that the 40-40-20, that way of thinking about tenure, I don't think that there's that kind of clarity often spoken about clinical. That it's less common, and I haven't really heard people say, oh, it's this. But it is a heavier load on teaching and less on research and service. For me personally, I would think it's about 60-20-20, 60 teaching, 20 service, 20 research. But it depends on the particular year where things can shift up a lot for clinical faculty, but heavier focus on teaching for sure.
So a question for maybe related to the job market, and I think Rosie, you addressed this already about what you were looking for, but when you're searching for jobs, when you're on the job market, did you consider both? Like, what was were you on your current track as the right fit from the beginning?
So I will say higher ed had, at least at the time I was on the market, fewer clinical appointments. I think there's increasing recognition in my field that we are an applied field, and there's a need for more clinical instruction to really link our scholarship to practice. Many faculty have been practicing educators in higher ed previously, but sometimes fewer now, to be honest, than maybe historically. So I think there's a need for folks with expertise and more intentional connections to practice. Because I think you can have worked in practice before, but not remain intentionally connected as you engage in your research. And so I will say that there were fewer things available. And when they were clinical, it was often like a visiting appointment. And I mentioned this before, I'm a mother scholar. I think when I was on the market, I had a 1-year-old, maybe she was turning 2 the year I was writing that dissertation. And the idea of trying to move with her and my husband, who also has a professional role that requires licensure as a nurse practitioner. If we're going to move somewhere, somebody also has to readjust their whole life. And so we really spent a lot of time talking through what kind of place do we want to live. I didn't apply to that many jobs because sometimes it was, I don't think this is going to be a good fit in terms of content. I'm not very viable in this pool. We as a family, as a multiracial family, I don't think we'll do very well in this space. Or, it's visiting and it looks good on paper, but if it doesn't become a tenure track or a longer term position, did we just up and move for a year? And are we willing to keep doing that? And I say that as somebody who had a career where, if you read from my bio, right, I like zipped across the country a lot and was getting to the point in my life where that was less ideal, because I wasn't just making decisions for me anymore. It was really thinking about an us, which is hard when you're thinking about the job market where there's lots of constraints. I will also say, I think in the beginning, I was really more open to working at comprehensive institutions where I might have, it still might be 40, 20, or on paper that, but really it is closer to 60. And I think my advisor asked me a question that said, he just said, well, how many classes do you want to teach here? And I honestly said, I don't know. So we have a dog visiting. I said, I don't know. And he said, well, do you want to teach 3 to 4 classes and do your research? Or is it, how are you envisioning spending your time? And I think what I realized, I honestly thought, I don't know if I can do the amount of research I want to do and teach, 4 classes a term, 3 to 4 classes a term. That was, I think, something that shaped my thinking, because there are tenure line positions where that is a reality. And that is about the institutional type that you're at versus tenure or clinical. So I think, I think I came in not wanting to do the research one thing. And lo and behold, my interest drove me to the R1 thing, much to my chagrin. That's not how I envisioned myself early in my career.
Yeah. Okay, thank you both. So, Rosie, something that you brought up that I know about Debi, even though she hasn't said it here, is the mother scholarhood that you both engage in. And so this is a question for both of you. So I just had a baby. He is 6 months. I start working in the fall. He's going to be 1 year old. And so I'm really interested in how you all balance like your professional life with your family life. So a lot of your family life helps you to make that decision of like, okay, we're going to move here. We're settling here. This is it. You know what I'm saying? Or maybe we'll stay here for 6 years and we'll move to another state. So I wanted to ask you all just, how do you balance those things, and how has your family and your life has affected your decisions, right? As you make it professionally, whether that's how much research you do, how much time you spend on campus, decisions of moving, things like that.
Well, oh my goodness, there's so much to that question. For me, it's a pretty big one. At different points in my career, my family has figured in different ways. And I want to say that when I initially made this decision, it was informed by my husband is a practicing teacher. And it was at a moment that it was very hard to find a teaching job. And that played a pretty big impact. And I graduated from Michigan, and we decided to stay in Michigan because of that. Another big reason I decided to stay in Michigan was my parents. So my parents are immigrants. They live locally. And I often think about how, there's this narrative in academia that you're supposed to like go to a new institution and bring fresh ideas. And that's just sort of like the accepted story about our field. But I've often felt that it is, it's unfortunately agnostic to the realities of families and the intergenerational connections. So for me, I've never had, people often think like, oh, your family's from another country. Don't you love to travel? And don't you love to, and there's these assumptions that come with that have always really annoyed me. Because my answer is quite simply no. Like I don't love to travel. I find travel pretty stressful, and I have traveled a lot as a child to India with with my parents, and it was hard. You know, it was wonderful, and it was also hard. And I like being where I am with my family close by. Like that is something I really value. And right now, I'm lucky to have my parents living in my neighborhood, and I'm blessed that they're healthy, even though they've had major health challenges. And so I don't take their health and their closeness, their proximity to me for granted. I really value, and that's another, bond. The bonds with elders are really valued in Indian culture. And so they don't live in my house, but being close to them is a pretty critical part of my life experience. And so that kind of, for me was a reason I stayed around in Michigan. And I thought also as my daughters got older, my daughters are now, I defended my dissertation when I had just had one child. Oh, just had one child and had the second like days after I defended my dissertation. So really similar to Ebony's experience. And there's so much pressure to like get on the job market, that whole get on the job market thing. Oh my goodness. I just could not.
Mm-hmm.
I just could not. I had two babies, I had a 1.5-year-old and a newborn. And I again, like I felt very privileged to have children. I just decided like, no, I'm not doing that. Like I have given my mind to this dissertation. I've given my mind, body, and spirit to this dissertation. Now I'm not going to do that for a little bit. And I'm going to give my mind, body, and spirit to my newborn baby and my infant child. Well, she felt like an infant then, but she was a 1.5-year-old. And so I took it kind of slow in the beginning. And I did a few little part-time things at the U and doing professional development. I looked at local jobs in school districts and at the state of Michigan. And I just kind of said to myself, I'm going to wait till the right thing happens that feels right. And that's, so things have emerged that way. And then the last thing I wanted to say about family and being a person of color. So I'm I'm an Indian woman. My children are multiracial. Their father is white and my parents are Indian. They live nearby. And for me, it's been pretty critical to have people of color nearby. So I have faced, days where I'll go to work and I'm just surrounded by whiteness all day long. And I know this feeling, especially when my daughters were very little, and I was still kind of establishing a scholarly community, a professional community. I hadn't really found my people yet. And I just like would crave coming home to my daughters to see someone with my skin color. Like, and it was more than the skin color. The skin color represented a lot. But then, and there would be weekends where I would be like, at that time, my parents didn't live nearby. They lived an hour away. And I just knew my top priority was like going to visit them just so I wouldn't feel so engulfed in whiteness. It was painful. Like I just needed so much to be close to people who looked like me. And I literally mean that looked like me, but also there was a lot more to it than just that, like not feeling alone, not feeling like I was so hyper aware of my race at work constantly, and every meeting and every, every navigation, I needed to just like drop that. And I could do that at home a little with my daughters and with my parents.
Thank you for sharing. And definitely like making those decisions. So like when you're transitioning from academia to, working outside of academia or being in academia, it's often like you need to go on the job market. You need to apply to every single job. You need to go wherever the money's at or wherever the great scholars are that you want to do research, even if that takes you 20 miles away, if that takes you internationally. And I think we don't hear enough stories about folks picking family first. You know what I'm saying? And saying like, I'm going to make these decisions around my family and what's important to me because my family comes first and my career afterwards. So I think that's an important perspective that we don't often hear in academia, at least with the pressures of the institution. Yeah. And Rosie, I'm really interested in your experience and the decisions you've made.
So one is that when I was an early career scholar, I think I had already become a faculty member, dear colleague, Dr. D.L. Stewart, who is at Colorado State, I said something about balancing something. And he said to me, balance is an illusion. That's not real. It's too ephemeral, right? And kind of planted the seed of the idea of work-life negotiation. Everything is negotiation. Everything is a push and pull, constant tension. Because and how I've kind of taken this up is if we convince ourselves everything is supposed to be in balance, the reality is we feel like we're always getting it wrong. Because it happens and then it's gone. The wind blows, it's gone. And I think that advice very early for me was so helpful in reframing. It wasn't me screwing something up. I didn't have to read 100 books about how to do another thing better. I was trying to figure out what worked for me. So I think that was, I continue to wrestle with that, right? Everything's negotiation rather than balance. Now, that negotiation process as a tenure track professor at a R1 institution meant I needed to get research in. And I was very fortunate. I will say that I wasn't looking for what I would call a family-friendly department or institution, but was fortunate to land in one, right? So those weren't questions I asked per se, but I could already tell that people were talking about their families comfortably, not trying to do the "do you have kids" kind of thing, because sometimes people do that, which is actually, you can't actually do that. But as they talk about their families, if you're comfortable, you can disclose, right? And my colleagues in student affairs and in the School of Education at Iowa State were just so helpful with helping me understand what it meant to be an early career faculty member and parent, because other folks had gone through it. I was lucky. I literally won the lottery to get my kid into the lab school at Iowa State, which was across the street from where I worked, which made it easy with early childhood educators. I was on the wait list for 6 to 7 daycares, and they do a lottery. And when my name got picked, I was like, oh, it alleviated a lot of stress for me in terms of knowing that I had a place for my child to go when I had to do things like teach. My department was really supportive with things like some of the classes in the evening. I said, well, my partner works 45 minutes away. If I teach an evening class, I have to bring this baby. There's literally, we don't know anybody. So kind of in opposition to Debi, we didn't have friends or family. Where is this child going to go? Do I pay for an extra caregiver after I just did caregiving all day? And so they were very supportive and said, you know what, let's figure out. So early in my career, I taught only during the day. My classes were during the day. And then as my child aged, and my husband had a different position that created flexibility for him on some days to pick her up. I taught at night. One semester, right? But they really were willing to support me in that, and that isn't always an option. But I found that my colleagues were very willing to do that, and they created space. It was not, if my kid had to come to school, that was okay, and I wasn't the only one doing it. And it wasn't only tenured faculty. Sometimes if a staff member had a child that was sick but not contagious, that there's that window, they're no longer febrile but not eligible to go back to school. We've had kind of informal systems where if you need to, your child might be in your office and someone's going to hang out with them for a little bit because you need to pop into something. That was supported. That is unusual, I will say. There are some departmental cultures or college level cultures where you can't do that, or someone would say it's a liability. And my department was, as a school of education, was this is the constraints we live in. If you need to bring bring your child. I had folks support me. I once taught, my kid was febrile and I had to teach. A colleague set up a Zoom. I told my class, and I literally taught over Zoom before Zoom was a thing.
Yeah.
I taught over whatever it was at the time because we didn't have Zoom yet. But my students saw me in a different human way, I think was the other important thing about this. For me, it felt like constraint at times, and other times it was like, well, this is like my real life. Like, I'm not going to be fake about it and pretend that I don't have constraints. I mean, they would laugh because the time I taught remotely, I had them in group work. I forgot to mute myself. And literally you could just hear me going, do you have to go potty? Mommy has a break. Like, right? Like, it is what it is. But I do think it made me seem like a real person to students to graduate. I teach in a graduate level program. I seem like a real person who lived a real life, who had a family. And I don't want to say had it all because that's not what it was. But had negotiations, right? I will say that my partner was very supportive because some of my research had me doing semi-ethnographic research. So I would try to plan out the semester. These are the days where I'm going to be traveling. And sometimes we would have, my mom in particular would fly in when she retired and come and help us for a few days if I had to conference, because we were both, not in a position where you could take days off of work. And I had family well enough to come physically help. So that was hard, kind of saying like, I have this research, I have to physically go somewhere. And for a while it was really intense to be gone that long, right? And so what I had to learn is when I was there, even if the urge was like, I have to respond to something, I need to grade, I need to like write something, to try to bracket, like, how do I learn to be present? And to not send the message that my work is more important than you. I struggle with that because I was raised in an immigrant household where you don't work to live, you live to work. And my partner is a work to live person. And I think that has been very helpful in grounding me in saying like, you need to shut it down if you want to stay in the game. Like in my head now, it's like, if I want to be a professor for a long time, you can't be a machine. You're just not, right? And so I have learned if I'm going to be present in my research, to be fully present in that. But once it's time to step away from that, to really try to be fully present with what I'm doing.
So you bring up an excellent point, Rosie, about negotiation. And so I never thought about it like that. We always talk about work-life balance, but it's a lot to negotiate. And I think also thinking about like where you are in your work trajectory, right? Whether you're new faculty or you've tenured, things change, right? And being able to negotiate those things is really, really important. And it made me think of, you talked about before Zoom was a thing, you were teaching, you asked, like, baby, you want to go potty, right? Like now we're in a time where folks are like, yeah, that's the thing. You know what I'm saying? Like, yes, we have kids around, we have animals around, we have things going on. Somebody's cooking in the kitchen, but we're going to learn, you know what I'm saying? So I think, we're moving into a time that, maybe academia will open up a bit more and allow people to be like humans and not machines. And that now that the pandemic has kind of pushed us to do that, which is something that we should have been doing all the time. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that.
I know I also have had a friend, colleague, Naomi Wilson, who said that it's not necessarily about work-life balance, it's a work-life harmony. And she's said that to me, and it's really stood out to me in thinking about, which parts of your life maybe carry the melody at a particular moment and which are the supporting undertones. And they're all different, but you're always trying to work towards something kind of in concert with each other and in harmony with each other. And that's a metaphor I've definitely tried to take up in the past year personally. So I do appreciate both of you sharing about that. We are going to ask about how you balance, find harmony. Gosh, I can't. How do we negotiate? How do we balance? How do we find harmony? Whatever words you want to choose. Our interest and our passions with research and teaching. I know even earlier, we talked about like 40, 40, 20, 60, 20, 20, like these, it seems like it's supposed to be maybe these neat boundaries or buckets of time. I think Debi, you said it's not the reality, but you know, even not even thinking about those bounded ratios, how do those interests of yours, or those passions and commitments that you have, blend across those spaces as well?
Well, I can share that earlier in my career, like when I was an assistant, I I really wasn't following my passions as much as I am now. You know, I was making a lot of decisions based on the pressures of the academy, you know, so really across all of those spaces. In my scholarship, there was one point early on, I felt like a lot of pressure as a clinical faculty member to show that I'm not only teaching, I'm also doing scholarship. But opening up, developing a body of research in a clinical space is different than the kind of scholarship I had done advisor as a graduate student. So in some ways, I felt like I was starting from scratch. And it took me a while to get my footing. And so I kind of I wrote a few pieces that were just emerging from things that I was doing, like a course I taught that was embedded in a school site. It was good work. It was valuable, but I was just kind of finding my footing. Like, I think I could write about this for a practitioner piece. I think I could do that. And I pulled it off. And I was just it was a little bit like something here, something there, something here. And I was sort of really just responding to the pressure. Similarly, in teaching, I was, my chair would tell me, like, I need you to teach these courses. And I would say, yes. And service requests were just overwhelming. I would get so many requests, and I just felt like I had to say yes. And I remember there was this one day, I remember it was the spring. It was a beautiful day, and I was running around doing like a few random things. One was at a school site. Somebody had invited me to like be a guest for an event. And I realized, I'm not going to say much more than that, but I realized sitting there, I was sitting in the audience, and I just realized that literally what I was doing was my body was being used. I was a body to fill this seat. It was so like literal at that moment. And, it was a lovely event, but like someone had invited me. I felt the pressure to say yes. I showed up, I, smiled, gave feedback. And the whole day I was thinking, like, it's this gorgeous day. And I am like just giving my body and to so many other people's needs. And this isn't where I want to be right now. Like something about the weather was calling me, and I wasn't passionate about where I was. I helped someone, there was someone I cared about who'd invited me, and I felt good about saying yes, but I didn't feel good at the end of the day. And then I just sort of like did a little step back, and I realized that was happening all over my life at that moment. I was kept like showing up in places for other people and not for my own self and my beliefs, my passions. And I think that moment really turned me on a new trajectory. And I began to really sort of interrogate every email. Like, okay, here's another one. Am I going to say yes? Am I going to say yes with some boundaries? Am I going to say no? And same with scholarship. I got, fortunately, those years of kind of saying yes to random things, I found the places where I was more inspired, and I did find some really productive relationships. And that made me, those places I was able to be a little bit more inspired and start to dream up scholarship that I really was passionate about. It wasn't scholarship of convenience, but scholarship of deep conviction. And that when I found that space of conviction in one place, it influenced my decisions in the other places as well. So one place I think about this a lot as a scholar of color is service, so in my service requests, I definitely get asked so much to do too much, and it is really hard sometimes. But I don't know, I just feel this real connection. When I feel a real connection to a person, like I do with both of you, Laura Ann and Ebony, like it's not even a question for me. Like it feels, it's like it's an internal yes. It's not just like a email send off the yes, the obligation. If I can feel deeply like this is a person that I believe in, and that I know that their work in this field is so deeply needed, and their success will will open doors for many people, like that will create a better, more just world. I honestly am thinking that about like justice when I say yes. If I say yes to this person, does this create an opportunity for that person to pursue a dream that will contribute to justice? Then I should do it. So I still feel like that sense of obligation, but I'm putting my own boundaries, my own parameters on like what I believe in and what I want to say yes to. And sometimes at the end of the day, I still am exhausted, and I still feel like in some ways I've been someone's audience member. But if I've been an audience member to that person who's really doing the right work and the kind of work that resonates with me, then I feel good about it. I feel good about being like in that seat as an audience member versus feeling like used. I don't feel that as much anymore, because I've learned how to say no lovingly, kindly, and where to say yes in ways that'll make me feel really proud.
It resonates with me a lot, Debi, like the idea that, well, a lot of it does, right? Part of it being a woman of color, like, why do you really want me in this space? Particularly, having been worked basically at predominantly white institutions, like what is my presence here for? And really having to sit with that and saying yes to the things that matter to me, even if they're not always rewarded. So probably the best example of that is when I was at Iowa State. For a number of years, I think one year I couldn't, at my very last year there, undergraduate students had asked me if I would be one of the facilitators for the Women of Color Network Retreat. I didn't sleep over because I'm like, I'm too old to sleep on these bunk beds. I love y'all, but I can't sleep on these bunk beds. I will leave and come back, I promise. Right? And it's like, it was true. I had to tell them with love, I can't sleep on these beds. And I wasn't the only one. But I thought to myself, like, there are so few women of color in this space at this institution, and rarely do they get this opportunity, right? And you are asking me to be with you for a reason, right? Now, is that going to be seen in my department as the best way to be engaged in service? It's not high profile, it's not scholarly. I didn't care. Those were the things, like every year, I think my colleagues came to see the value in it, and they understood the history of the retreat. But I honestly could care less, because those students, what I got out of being there as an educator, and what those students also poured into me, the reciprocity there, is what kept me year to year, right? That time was well spent. I have learned to use a committee of no. And sometimes that committee varies on the membership depending on what it's for, because I had to learn the hard way that not every opportunity is an opportunity. Kind of like the seat filling thing, like not every opportunity is an opportunity. And to really have some folks ask me some good questions, lovingly, people I trust, and they will often help me work through, is this something that actually I want to say yes to, or do I feel I have to? And, the reality is often if people ask you and they have real intent, if you say no, they will ask you again. If you say, I don't have time, like this, I I wouldn't be able to do it justice now if it's something you're considering, but you just can't do. The reality is people who value you will come back. I think I've also just thought about kind of that question about integrating our work. I mean, I study graduate students. My scholarship has moved in the direction of really focusing on grad ed, right? So, and I have learned a lot. I've been focusing a lot on what grad students learn about equity, diversity, and inclusion in grad school across the disciplines. Not surprisingly, the answer is often not much, right? So what is my role as an educator then to make sure that doesn't happen in my program, right? How do I take what I learned in practice and my research with grad students to better improve the actual grad ed I do day to day? And so for me, that's been like a working back and forth between, and how do I take what I know works in education and share that with my partners in STEM for whom it's not normative per se, to think about students' identities, not all STEM folks, but some of the folks that I'm working with, to really think about how do I take what I know and share it, not just as like a researcher, like not as the idea that I'm trying to, I don't worry about will this intervene? And the reality is I don't want students to be harmed. So some of my thinking, even about my role in the research process and equity-oriented research that isn't necessarily always participatory action, I still have a duty beyond just sharing findings in a publication. Like there's a duty there to surface and raise up what is happening and to engage with folks to think about how, particularly because I'm often surfacing when people are being hurt and harmed in grad ed, to really think about what are we going to do differently? Because honestly, I can't wait for a publication for this to come out. Like we have to change things sooner. And so that has really guided my work. It's guided my reasons for coming back, right? To think about how do I want to engage here as a returning, as an alum of the University of Michigan. Like, what do I want to do to make this place a place that is where grad students feel as though they are honored and whole. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot, but these are like, to me, there are these discrete buckets I report, but when I think about my work, it's often more of a mangled mishmash of things that I do that are often rooted in the things I care about, justice, equity, and justice being at the heart.
And I think that's important. I think often when we're applying to graduate programs, we're kind of like, we want to do this thing, right? Oh, I want to do teacher education, right? And we're not often like necessarily reflecting on like, well, what does this mean for like my life's work? You know what I mean? And I think we need to start, when we're applying to programs, just thinking about, okay, so what do I want my life's work to be, right? How am I impacting my community or communities around me? You know, what program can help me to do that? Where can I be of service? Things like that, I think is like super important. And I think for me, I entered, and I think that's partly because I'm a teacher and I'm like, I want to help the children and I don't want you to harm the children. So my life's work is to help you not harm the children. You know what I'm saying? But we don't always like think in that way. Like, oh, what's my life work going to be? Who am I going to be supporting when I go to this university? Am I supporting students of color? Am I supporting students in STEM? Am I doing these different things? And I think that needs to be a part of our thinking too, when we say, okay, well, we want to do a clinical track position or a visiting position or a tenure position, that kind of thing. So yeah, thank you for the work that you're doing at Michigan. So last question before we have to go, because we're running low on time. I just wanted you each to share, what are some of the affordances and constraints of having a clinical or tenure position? I think some things came up in terms of like time and negotiating and balancing, but if there's anything else that you can share that you think might be affordances and constraints when graduate students are thinking about hitting the market, that'd be great.
Well, you know, the major limitation with clinical is that you can't get tenure. You don't have that, you know, definitiveness of knowing the length of your term. But I have managed that. You know, I've been like, I've thought to myself, I've always had, before I was in the academy, that was the norm. You don't really ever know if you're going to have a job in the long term. So I think I can manage that. So that's how I dealt with that limitation. The major affordances are, if you love teaching, which I do, then there's a lot of space to really not just teach, but think about teaching, invest in teaching, study teaching. For educators, there's a lot of potential to be in schools. And for me, something I didn't say before is graduate school. I did enjoy the research, but I truly feel like I was experiencing a period of grief. Like I mourned being with my students, the children. I literally I felt a hole in my heart for years of just not being able to be in K-12 settings. So clinical work allows me to keep that part of my work alive. I do a lot of work in schools. I do professional development. I do field instruction. I have colleagues and friends who are teachers and administrators. I'm constantly in conversation with folks in schools. And something else I wanted to say is I've found this affordance, which is that there is much more flexibility in the kinds of scholarship. So just sort of in a technical way, like it's true that that's an affordance, that you can write for practitioner outlets, you can write on a blog, you can have different kinds of things sort of count, that I know that tenure track folks don't have that liberty for promotion and tenure. But in addition to kind of that from a technical angle, I have found that I enjoy writing again. Like when I was in graduate school, I was bored by the style of academic writing. It really didn't thrill me. And it took me a while to figure out that I could take some risks in my writing again, that I could think about like beautiful writing. I used to enjoy reading fiction, I used to enjoy poetry, and like those things had kind of, dulled during graduate school for me. And I have recently learned like I can reignite that spark and figure out how to bring a little bit more creativity back into my writing. I don't think I'm like expert at it in any way, but I'm enjoying like opening that part of me up again. And I think that the clinical track affords enough flexibility that I can experiment a little bit. And I've been enjoying that.
So I would say the constraints, or what makes it challenging, honestly, is being on the tenure track is it's exhausting, right? Like and I would say every institution varies in its degree of clarity on what it takes to earn tenure, right? There are some systems where you quite literally get a number, like this is the number of things you need to publish. Most places aren't like that. It's kind of like guidance, like loosely, maybe 2 things a year-ish in top tier. That's kind of the guidance I was given. Aim for about 2 things a year in top tier venues, or close to it. Like if you're bringing in a bunch of research grants and you are collecting data, you might not reach that number, right? But there's also pressure to bring in money, particularly at our Research One institution. So I think that's an important distinction. You can be tenure track at lots of different kinds of places, but particularly at a Research One institution, a top tier AAU, which is the American Association, or it's like the top 200 research universities. You got to grind, like you are publishing, bringing money. It's a lot, right? To kind of feel that way. I think I learned to stop thinking of it as trying to hit some sort of magic place, as much as it is what is it that I want to share, and where do I want to share it? Because I do think if it's always framed through it feels like the meat grinder, but it doesn't. You can frame it in ways. In my head was like, I have things that I want to say. How do I get them into spaces that I want to share this work? And with whom do I want to write with? That's just hard. I will also say that very few jobs, I can't think of any others, honestly, that have like a 5 to 6 year probation period. right? Like most jobs is like a few months and then they're like, you're good, right? And often on the tenure track, you literally have like a second or third year review. Some do 2 and 4 and 6. Iowa State did a third year review. So really your contract is 3 years. And then it's like, if you're doing a pretty good job, you get to keep going, right? And you get some guidance about what you need to do to earn tenure, right? 6 years is a long time to operate as though you are living with like this might not happen. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of weight on people, your mental health, just your general well-being. And so really thinking through is, again, like for me, it's always, what is the kind of life I want to live? For me, that was the constraint. Feeling I constantly needed to produce, and particularly as a woman of color, that I need to produce, be the best teacher, be of service to all the students of color, show up for all the other faculty of color, right? I was in a position where I was put into leadership roles pre-tenure because there weren't a lot of senior faculty before I would say is usually advisable. But there I was, right? And so it was a lot. It was a lot. Now, if that's the part that was very hard, I will say the benefits are that I control most of my time, right? Like I can decide for better or worse, right? Like maybe not teaching, but like what projects do I want to say yes to? When do I want to write? What time do I want to carve out for meeting with students? And I had to learn to do that more intentionally because I used to just give away my time way too freely, my energy, like at the drop of a hat. And then I'm like, why am I not writing anything? Because I would drop everything to help everybody else that will not earn you tenure. And so I think the ability to control my time mattered a lot. Higher ed is hierarchical, and being tenure track and tenured allows you to engage in decision making that lots of other folks at the institution don't get to do. And that is an unfortunate reality as a former university staff person, to know that in some spaces my voice as a faculty person matters more. So how do I want to use that voice matters. So and the reality is I get a lot of joy out of teaching. I also get a lot of joy out of research. Like I didn't think I would, but again, like that intellectual, one of the reasons I left my professional practice was in some ways I was not being intellectually challenged. I was emotionally challenged. I was challenged in all sorts of ways as a mid-level professional. But what it wasn't doing was stimulating my brain in the kind of ways that made me think differently, harder, more innovatively. And that was just my particular role at the time. So what I know now is that I am always thinking in nimble ways and thinking about what does this mean for real people? Like for me, I'm always driven by what's the so what of this that I'm doing? Yeah. What's the so what for the people? Like if I can't tell you the so what, I probably should not be doing it. Right? Like I'm just not here for intellectualizing for the sake of intellectualizing in an applied field in particular. So I don't know. It's like the tenure track life there's definitely constraints, but I do like the freedom and the intellectual stimulation it's given me. Like for me, that's been really helpful.
I think that's important. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yes.
And I think this just a decision we all have to make, right? Like, what is it that we value? What is it that's going to drive us? And if that comes through a tenure track position or a clinical position or research or visiting, then that's where we go, where we're going to be driven to expand our knowledge and to be able to do the work that we want to do. Right. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
And that work can happen in lots of different positions, and the work looks different at various institutions. And I think that is the piece that, in addition to role, for people to think about what kind of institution is this? Yeah. Like that is a huge, for me as a tenure track professor, what kind of resources do they have?
Yeah.
That's like a huge thing. Like the infrastructure, like if you want me to bring in money, are there people to help me once I get a grant? Right? Like those are things that I didn't know them until I was in it. And I was like, oh, right. And you're talking to a friend and they don't have any help. And you're like, oh, okay, this is better. Like,
Yeah.
this is hard and good
Yeah.
is kind of where I've landed in my faculty work, right? It's hard, but hard in a good way for me, not hard in like a, I don't want to do this kind of way. And I think that is a thing for folks to really think about, like what feels challenging and stimulating, but not to the point where you feel like I can't or don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
If we're in that place, and it might even just be the institution, not the work itself, is something that we grapple with, right? When people make choices to leave the academy, is it all of the academy or is it this place? Sometimes it's all of it, right? But, I stay for a reason.
Yeah.
Wow.
Any last words?
you.
Thank you so much, Rosie.
Yeah.
Thanks. And my dog stopped barking and now she's in a ball in my lap. I was like, devil, are you serious right now?
She knew what she wanted.
I know. All right. Well, it was good to talk to you both.
You too.
Thank you so much.
All
Thank
right.
you so much for joining
Thank
us
you.
today.
Thank you all. I really
Debi.
enjoyed this.
Thank you for joining us for We Need to Name This, a series where we unpack the hidden curriculum of academia. Join us for our next episode, Advising Graduate Students, with Dr. Chandra Alston. For more information, visit www.weneedtonamethis.com.